came up with the idea of gathering at 1:30 and sent me a text and also to the other leadership of the precinct. And then I turned around and sent an email out to everyone on the list. So I don't know. Do you get my charming emails, I trust?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that should have come around about 1:15. And if you're,
I probably,
if you're looming over email perpetually like I am, you might have caught it, but if not.
okay.
And then we shot it out on some of our social media channels on Facebook and Instagram and so forth. So
Okay.
it was one of those flash things. But we were there till 5, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, messing around. So yeah, full day yesterday, full week, I would say.
I heard yesterday, this is Charlie, through Ruby Houston, that there's another gathering at 3 on the green this afternoon.
Yeah, I heard that. Something about, did you hear any of the details about that, Charlie?
No,
Something about the slide,
no.
I heard.
Yeah, no details did I hear.
Okay. Well,
And Greg, are you ready to shift gears and talk about religion along with politics?
yeah,
Morning.
yeah, I suppose I could slip into that mode.
Now that you're all rested, right?
Yes, or something.
Or something.
So you're doing so Van, I understand you're doing the introductory duties here.
I'm doing it, but it's based on what John wrote. So I hope it's been approved.
All right.
We'll wait a couple more minutes and then kick this off and see if we can learn something this morning.
Well, let's hope.
Yeah,
I have got, let's see, who's the, I know your first name isn't actually Zoom there.
It's William Lee.
Hey, William. So can you make me a co-host so I can share my screen?
Oh, yes. Let
I've
me.
already done that, but I have a boring textual PowerPoint presentation to show you all. This was some excerpts from the
Make co-host.
so you can track along. So hopefully I can put that up there.
All right. Let's see. You good now on the co-host deal?
Let me see. Yeah, I got my share screen thing here. So
All right.
Hey, William, I have a different question.
Yes.
Why, and this has happened every Sunday. Why does the live video start before and we're just chatting politics, and that really shouldn't be on the church's website. So I'm wondering why we start on YouTube live so early.
John's checklist told us to start at 9:40. So
All right, well, that
it's John's fault. We'll blame him. But
So
yeah.
our private patter has been going out across the entire internet, I guess.
Yes.
So if we need to back that up, I can shoot John a message on that.
Well, I trust we didn't say anything too outrageous in those
Nah.
few minutes.
Hopefully
Good
not.
point, though.
So we're getting real close to 9:45 starting time, and the Covenant class is delighted to have Greg Snyder joining us for the next 4 weeks. He's a professor of religious studies at the college and has a BS from Seattle Pacific University and an MS from Columbia and 3 degrees from Harvard. Can't get out of that place.
What? Wait.
A master's in philosophy and a master's in divinity. He teaches courses on early Christian literature, both inside and outside of the canon, and on the history of the Bible, and on subjects related to classics, especially Roman religion. Before coming to Davidson, Greg taught at St. Mary's College. He's married to Motria, and they have 3 children. Some of them are in college or out of college, something like that. This is the first Sunday of 4, and Greg is going to be talking about render under Caesar for this series, and he's going to edge on the relationship between religion and politics. And considering the last couple of weeks, this could be interesting. Greg says he wants to base his conversations on books that are somewhat related and somewhat different. Today's is Philip Gorski's American Covenant. And maybe a promo for next week would be Kevin Cruz's One Nation Under God. For those of us who are slow readers, get started early. And Greg, if you want to correct anything that I have misstated, please do so and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Van. I appreciate the intro. There is one misconception I should probably clear up, given this Ivy League rivalry, that I did actually go to Yale rather than Harvard. So I wouldn't want to leave that misperception out there, right? Which, I sort of clear that up right away. But, pardon that pretentious clarification there. It's great to be here with all of you. Thanks for turning out. This class comes at a terribly significant and portentous time. I think we've all been ruminating on politics and religion, and so I had arranged some, last year actually, when I was thinking about my teaching schedule, to teach this course, which I've done once before. So this is the second time I've done it. I put in some new books for this iteration of the course, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next 4 weeks. But I can't start the class without without a nod to Tony, right? For so many years, I must have taught this course, I imagine, at various points for 20 years since I came to Davidson here, first in 1998. And you could always rely on Tony to come around at a certain point in the year and tug on your shirt sleeve and ask you to teach the Covenant course. That was predictable. And he was such a gracious and delightful and erudite and light person that it was always a pleasure to be with Tony, always a pleasure to teach in the course, to be introduced by him, and to hear his sort of perceptive and generous questions. And it's a loss to not have him here, but I think can treasure his memory, and I feel like he's hovering over this in some way. So anyhow, I just wanted to say a word about Tony. I think he's a beneficent presence here. Let me just, this is Sunday school. I don't do this in class, obviously. Let's just say a quick word of prayer before we start, if that's okay. Gracious God, thank you for this time together. And we ask your blessing on our reflections, on the things that I say. Pray that these would be beneficial, help our thinking, help our living, and our believing. Amen. So here, let me say just a little quick word about at least how I head into this whole Zoom etiquette, right? I've been doing classes over Zoom, and this seems to be the new reality, at least for a little while. And one thing I find about Zoom is I'm actually fine if you all unmute, and if at some point when I'm talking, if you want to like raise your hand or can I, I'm gonna rely on John Kirkendall for some corrections and clarifications at various. Yes, there you are. Good. Okay, so you haven't gone dark yet. You're still there on video, so that's good. That's a good sign. So I'm fine if folks stay unmuted. Now, if you've got a barking dog in the background or a barking uncle, or you're having a coughing fit or something like that, feel free to mute. But it's fine with me if people are unmuted and they want to interject. I feel like sometimes people are silenced. It's just too much, a little bit monolithic with the speaker downloading things on a passive and mute audience, which is just not how I think about teaching, even in a Zoom world. So with that said, feel free to unmute. And yeah, if there's a little bit of, noise coming from here and there, that's just sort of a natural environment for a group that's gathered. So I can live with that. And again, if you'd like to interject, got a question, you want to slow down, clarification, something like that, I'm happy to entertain those along the way. I don't have a continuous stream of polished oratory to treat you to here. So that's the Zoom preface. A little bit of background to the class. When Tony asked me to teach the course a year ago, I was thinking that I would do something inspired by New Testament texts that bear on religion and politics, right? You can think of some famous texts: render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's, or Paul's recommendation in Romans 13 to obey the emperor, and classic texts like that have informed Christian reflection about how religion and politics are to be related. But as I got closer to the day of teaching and thinking about it, it seemed to me perhaps a little preferable to pivot and treat you to 4 different books that I am using in my religion and politics course that I'm teaching at the college right now. And a couple reasons for this. I think this set of 4 books is good and timely. They interlock in interesting ways. I think they are the kinds of things that, if you're a hard charger and you want to get into this stuff, you could actually get hold of these things and sample from them a little bit in a way that would, raise the quality of our reflection in future weeks. So here's what I'm going to do. Let me see if I can successfully share screen. Okay. Now, are you seeing what looks like a PowerPoint presentation there? Was that somebody saying yes? I heard.
Yes.
Something.
Yes.
4 books.
I heard.
Yes.
Wait a minute. Now my screen has just gone completely dark. Why is this?
Ours looks good.
Wait a second. Is it? Well, these things. Wait. What happened when I?
We see the PowerPoint window, but it hasn't gone to slideshow yet.
Oh, there we go. No. Okay. Now, how about it? Are you seeing slides here?
No.
No.
It's not in slide mode. It's like the screen you see when you're trying to edit it.
Oh, but now I've gone. Okay. Well, use slideshow. Well, when I do that, it just. Oh, how about that?
That's good.
Yes.
That's good.
That look better? Okay. All right. Excellent. So just to tell you what's coming up, here are the 4 books that I'm using in the course and that we'll look at in this series of morning classes. So the first of them is Philip Gorski, American Covenant, which just came out a couple of years ago. Talk about that today. Kevin Kruse's book, One Nation Under God. Kevin Kruse is a historian at Princeton, and this is a book that I've used now twice in the course, and that is it's really excellent. And just to give you a brief preview of it, in case you wanted to check it out, there's a long-standing debate about the degree to which America is a Christian nation, or founded as a Christian nation. And again, John, you would be able to expound on this a lot more than I would, or Bill Strong if he's out there. But Kruse's claim in this book is that what we now normally take for the Christian aspect of American culture doesn't go back really to the Puritans or to the founding fathers in the 1700s. It really goes back to a group of conservative ministers and anti-New Deal businessmen who wanted to react against FDR's New Deal policies. And that some of the language that, the under God clause in the Pledge of Allegiance, the, God language on stamps and on money, a lot of the debates about religion in schools and so forth, all of this grows out of really the 1930s and post New Deal kinds of developments. A lot of historians have said that some of this is really related to the Cold War, and it's deeply related to the Cold War, but Cruz wants to kind of reset that and think in terms of economics impinging on this. And I don't know if you can see in your slide there the subtitle of it, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. So it's really fascinating. It's a great read. It's a very quick-paced, accessible book. So that'll be for next week. This other book, Divided by Faith, Evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America. This was written in 2000. This is the oldest book out of the four. So it was written now almost 20 years ago, but it has aged very well. And in fact, I think even in the last 4 months since George Floyd and all the talk that we've been hearing about systemic racism, this book just seems prophetic and timely. And it talks about how Protestant evangelical religion tends to conduce to what they would call not so much racism or systemic racism, but racialization of society, even in spite of some of, I think Christianity's best attempts or impulses, that the way things cash out sociologically, theologically, given what they would call the sociological toolkit that most evangelicals have, that this all results in a further racialization of society and of ecclesiastics. So that's a really excellent book as well. Did someone want to chip in there? I heard someone. Yeah. Oops. I'll really go back. And then the final one here is this book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So some of you may have heard of Jonathan Haidt. He crops up on TED Talks and other kinds of public venues. He is, I guess what you could call a political psychologist or a psychological sociologist or something like that. I think he's teaching at NYU now, but he basically approaches this from the standpoint of group psychology, cognitive psychology, the psychology of groups, to explore and understand why people are having such a hard time speaking about politics and religion. And he explores this in great detail and depth. And this is also very timely for our divided society at this moment. So these are the 4 books we've got. They're all interestingly different. Gorski is sort of a little bit more philosophical, political. Kevin Cruz is historical. Divided by Faith is sociological. And The Righteous Mind is something like political psychological. So each of these books is written with a different kind of methodology in mind. So we're getting different angles of approach to this question of religion and politics. So I loved all these books, and the students loved them, and I hope you will too. So that's what's coming up. I need to be a little careful of my time here. Stay on schedule. It's 9:59. So we have until, is it 10:45, man? That's when
That's correct.
okay. We gotta shoot you all out again. Okay, so how come that's not advancing? There we are. Okay. So what we're looking at today, Philip Gorski's American Covenant: A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, an authoritative account of the long battle between exclusionary and inclusive versions of the American story. So, like I said in the last slide, book is just recently out, 2017. Gorski himself, there he is a professor of sociology at Yale University, did his work at University of California, Berkeley, under Robert Bellah, who we'll see a little bit more about in just a minute. This is a book he's trying to make a strong argument in this book. It's not just, here is a descriptive account of religion and politics in America since the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He really wants to accomplish something with this book. Actually, let me go back here. And I just to try to sum up what that is, he sees that American society and political life is highly polarized, highly divided. And what he's trying to do with this book is find something like a vital center that can bind together people from both sides of the political spectrum that aren't on the opposing fringes, right? Some of these folks will probably be outside the realm of conversation, but he thinks he can draw a circle around a vital center, a sensible middle that would include both liberals and progressives and conservatives and moderates and so forth, and unite them with a shared understanding of this idea of American civil religion. So that concept of American civil religion is central to the book. Now let me see. I got to get my my notes and my PowerPoint presentation here properly arranged. So now you should still be looking at the PowerPoint presentation. Is that right?
Yes.
You are. Okay. Not at my private and messy notes. So I'm going to be toggling a little bit back and forth between these things, and hopefully I can do it in a seamless way. So Gorski, like I said, he started this book. He finished the book in 2017. He started the book in 2008, which was the beginning of Obama's presidential term. And he mentions in the introduction that he started this book in a hopeful time, I think partly on the promise of Obama's vision for America, and perhaps even in response to a particular speech that Obama gave on the subject of race. And that he ended this book in 2017 in a less hopeful time. Donald Trump had been elected president, or at least a less hopeful time from the standpoint of Philip Gorski. So, I think when the book came out, the national mood was very different than when he began the book. And so I think it's probably I don't think he saw that coming. In 2008, when he started this book, he didn't see 2016 coming. So that adds an interesting umbrella over the work as a whole. But you can even see, right, from the very cover of the book, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, that the idea of civil religion is probably the backbone of this book. And civil religion as a concept has a history in various thinkers. I think probably Rousseau and Locke and people like that have used that term. But the person who really made that more concrete, specific, and technical was this fellow, Robert Bellah, who taught at Cal Berkeley for many years. And he was Gorski's dissertation advisor, I think, or at least worked with Gorski, where Gorski was a graduate student there. And Bellah wrote this article, Civil Religion in America, in 1967. John, is this something that John Kirkendall, did you get all over this essay in some of your classes at all?
Yes, I used it in American religious history as one aspect of starting the whole thing.
Okay. So, well, if you need to, again, like I said, if you need to break in here and straighten me out on something, you feel free.
Wouldn't dare.
Well, you're being too kind as usual there, I think. So this article, Civil Religion in America, is, I think, one of the touchstones for Gorski's book. And even this little initial quote, which I've just excerpted here from the article itself, gives you a sense for what Bella is trying to do here. While some have argued that Christianity is the national faith, and others, the church and synagogue celebrate only the generalized religion of the American way of life, few have realized that there actually exists alongside of, and rather clearly differentiated from the churches, an elaborate and well institutionalized civil religion in America. And this article argues not only that there is such a thing, but also that this religion, or perhaps better, this religious dimension, has its own seriousness and integrity and requires the same care in understanding that any other religion does. So Gorski goes on to talk about how this American civil religion, and let me see what I've got on my next slide here, has got, I'll pull that up, has got a lot of the characteristics that you would assign to a religious belief. It seems to feature certain kinds of beliefs. It seems to feature certain kinds of symbols, rituals, sacred texts, sacred sites, cult objects, and even sort of savior figures in a way. And we can trot through a few of these things. But at the beginning of his article, he trots out Kennedy's inauguration speech as an instance of this American civil religion, how it crops up at a key moment. You could call it a religious moment, an inaugural ceremony at when John Kennedy was inaugurated as president. A couple excerpts from Kennedy's speech. We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning. I won't need to read all of this, I don't suppose. I have sworn before you and Almighty God, the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. Man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and to abolish all forms of human life. Yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. That's from the introductory portions of Kennedy's speech. And then the speech concludes, finally, whether you're citizens of America or of the world, ask of us the same high standards of strength and sacrifice that we shall ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. So, I mean, you can spot, and maybe there's aspects of that speech that kind of leap out as indicating or signaling something about this civil religion. I don't know, just to kick it out to you so we get a little bit of a conversation and maybe somewhat less of a lecture. I mean, what strikes you about that speech is particularly religious, would you say?
Well, Greg, he seems to take for granted that most people are on the same page and very comfortable with referring to God. Is that what we're talking about with civil religion?
Yeah, no, exactly. That would be one thing. He is making certain assumptions about the audience, right? There's that, there's the God language. What any other observations about that would lead you to think that he is invoking or dipping into or referring to maybe things that are sort of off stage that might be considered religion or a religious dimension? What would you say?
I think he's also assuming that the forebears prescribed this, as he mentions in the last sentence of the first paragraph, and he's building on that premise.
Yeah. There's sort of traditions, right? That people are standing in a stream of tradition and history that goes back into the past that we share and that we are perpetuating. Yeah, so there's that element of tradition, a past. A theologian might call it a kind of salvation history, perhaps. Anything else?
He repeats from the Declaration the idea that rights come from God.
Right. There's sort of an invocation almost, or an allusion to what you could call a sacred text, and that that the rights that people enjoy are not finally anchored in a particular style or system of government, but in fact they have this transcendental reference point that is God. Anything else that people notice in reading that strikes you as especially religious, or that might, if you were trying to say, if this is an instance of American civil religion, what could we learn about what that is?
It fell in the aftermath of Eisenhower, and also in the context of a fair amount of WASP wonder about whether we should have a Roman Catholic as our president.
Yeah. I mean, you may that was an extremely lively subject of conversation. I can't say that I was really of the age of reason when that was going on. I think I was about 5 at the time, so I don't have a lot of recollection to share. But historically, right, that was very important. I think it's probably a little bit similar to the discussion, though, that people had about Mitt Romney becoming president. Like, what's going to happen if a Mormon becomes president, right? Is he going to be taken over and programmed by the mother church and foist all kinds of alien religion on us? And I think there might have been some parallel anxieties there with Romney. So
Greg,
yeah,
one more.
Charlie, he had to come out and, like, in certain ways, reaffirm a commitment to a framework of belief that kind of took him out of that zone a little bit, right? The fear of the Roman Catholic control.
Greg, one other thing that strikes me is that the very last sentence has sort of a missionary undertone to it. We can't just, we need to go out and do something. We need to convert people. And I think that's,
Yeah. There's this hortatory dimension to it, right? And then just the inclusive language of we, it really does have that sermonic exhorting to greater moral efforts, going out and making sacrifice, right? All of those terms have theological valence to them. So, even right there, there's, 4 or 5 aspects of that I think you could say would be typical of what Bella and then Gorski following him would call American civil religion. What you don't see is a lot of sectarian Jesus language, right? So whatever this American civil religion is, it sort of resists that level of specificity and sectarianism. It's not explicitly Christian. It's going to talk about Almighty God, but theologically speaking, the category of God is left fairly expansive. It would be broad enough to include Christians and Jews and Catholics and, in principle, people of other monotheistic faiths as well. Although, outside of monotheistic faiths, right, you might ask about the status of those folks, right? Are all of them included? So anyhow, that is just a little piece of Bella's article and a little instance of what might be called religion of civil religion. And I think to go through all of this, I won't go through all, sort of the beliefs and the rituals and the sacraments and so forth. But if you had to just say a few things about belief, this excerpt from from Ben Franklin is pretty good when it comes down to what you might call the metaphysical creedal aspects of American civil religion. Franklin says, I was never without some religious principles. I never doubted, for instance, the existence of the deity, that he made the world and governed it by his province, that the most acceptable service of God was the doing of good to men, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded either here or hereafter, right? That would be a fairly pithy expression of what you could call the metaphysical principles of American civil religion. But then you have all these other furnishings of religion, right? You would have symbols of the flag, for example. You'd have sacred texts, which might be the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. You might say that something like the Gettysburg Address, or maybe Lincoln's second inaugural, might rise to the level of a sacred or at least a canonical text. You have other texts like the Federalist Papers that might have a kind of a secondary deuterocanonical status, as it were. You have rituals like Memorial Day or Independence Day or inaugural celebrations. You might even think in terms of cult objects. I know when I went up to Washington, D.C., and you go in to see the Declaration of Independence, just all the way that all of these documents are exhibited and displayed. It's this, it's definitely, kind of like, it's definitely feels like a sacred space where these things are displayed. There's a sacred character to them. And then more broadly, in closing these places, you have sites of pilgrimage, right? Maybe the Lincoln Memorial among them, places in DC that we've all dropped in. And then you've also got characters who rise to the level, I don't know, perhaps of saints or even, savior figures, right? I mean, if you had to make an equivalence, George Washington might count as a kind of a Moses figure, a founder figure, right? Who finally sets on his feet this new republic and establishes independence from this slavery to Great Britain, and finally sets this new nation on a course of its own. Washington would kind of serve that. There's this typological way of reading the events in American history over against the events that you see in the Hebrew Bible. George Washington seems to match up to the character of Moses in certain respects. Abraham Lincoln would be another character who, in light of his sacrifice and martyrdom, is probably the closest thing to Jesus Christ that you could get in American history, sealing that covenant with his blood, and practically apotheosized, I think. And John, you might have more to say on that subject.
Well, I think you could almost see a trinity with George Washington, the creator, being the founder figure, and his monument being a phallic symbol. And Lincoln Memorial is a temple in which sacrifices were regularly made. And you go out to Arlington Cemetery and you see the eternal flame on the grave of John Kennedy, the flame of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, okay. So So you're going to put John Kennedy there, or associate him with the Holy Spirit there.
I think from the perspective of Bella at the time he wrote, that was likely more adequate description than it is today. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, probably with a little more historical perspective, people would want to, and Gorski does this, right? He wants to include Martin Luther King Jr. in that sort of pantheon, which kind of disrupts the neat trinity.
Yeah.
Unless you're willing to admit a quaternity, or
people are doing that all the time, Greg.
What's that?
People are doing a quaternity and more all the time. So
yeah, well, you have to decide which you want to admit to the Trinity and which you want to just admit to the community of saints, right? Is there a distinction to be made there? Anyhow, so all of these things I think would be typical of American civil religion. And interesting thing about this is that Robert Bella, he wrote this article in 1967, but then later, I think, at the end of the Vietnam War, at the end of the Watergate crisis, I want to say like he kind of lost faith in this whole project. And I don't know, I won't get off screen, but he wrote this little book called The Broken Covenant. I don't know if you can see that there in the little window I'm holding up, in which he basically kind of turned around and just seemed to be disenchanted with this whole idea of American civil religion, was just about ready to give up on it, called it a broken, an empty shell, not something he thought that could really function to bind Americans together anymore. I think in the disenchantment of the late 60s, the assassination of Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Vietnam, Watergate, all of these things, I think, made it hard to think in terms of some creed that could bind Americans together, or that had integrity and quality to do so. But Gorski comes along, and it seems like he's inspired by the character of Barack Obama. And this little excerpt I've got right here is actually not from Gorski himself. It's from a review of Gorski's book. But Gorski does talk about Barack Obama's speech that he delivered in Philadelphia on, I think it was March of 2008, specifically on the subject of race. And he found in that speech so many allusions to chapters and elements and characters in American history that it seemed like it lit the flame under this idea of American civil religion. And one of the things that got Gorski to think in terms of trying to rehabilitate the concept. So thinking about the speech, the opening was taken from the preamble to the Constitution. The narrative drew from the Hebrew Bible. There's talk of founding covenants, the Declaration, the Constitution, of original sins, the sin of African slavery, people's backsliding, marching, Jim Crow, civil rights, promised land. So all of this stuff figured into Obama's speech, and I think this is one of the things that made Gorski want to write this book. But as he goes on to say here, I quickly concluded, though, that Bella's map needed some updating. For one thing, American civil religion needed to be more clearly roped off from two close rivals. Bella had not drawn a sharp enough line between the American civil religion and what I call American religious nationalism, the sort of apocalyptic and nativistic hyper-patriotism that has driven so many of America's witch hunts and imperial misadventures over the centuries. I also concluded that my account had to give more attention to what I call radical secularism, the sort of secular progressivism that seeks to dispense with any notion of tradition and bar all religious expression from the public square. I came to see the American civil religion as a via media between these two extremes. So that is what Gorski is going for. Oops, I'm having a Zoom issue here. Oh, there we go. All right. So we got Gorski's map. So a little bit more about this center, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk. This vital center. That center consists of many Americans, and now being blocked. All right. Believers and non-believers, Republicans and Democrats who support a moderate form of secularism and a liberal form of nationalism. They're concerned that church and state not become too entangled in one another's affairs, but they do not believe you can take religion entirely out of politics or vice versa. They know that the American project has a moral and a spiritual core. They also value American culture and institutions enough to cherish and defend them, but without succumbing to the conceit that America is always and everywhere a force for good in the world. They're the natural constituency of the vital center. This book is addressed to them. It is an effort to give voice to the historical tradition that undergirds their deepest convictions in a time when the best are denounced for lacking all conviction. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what he is, what he's going for with this book, and that concept of this, this vital center that he's trying to address. So in a visual format, he would think in these terms: radical secularism involves a total separation of religion and politics. So there's just no overlap. Civil religion, which would form this middle zone in here, is partial overlap between religion and politics. And religious nationalism, he sees as an unhealthy overlap between religion and politics. Probably something like German Christianity in World War II, right? When German imperial Nazi ideology and German religion merged almost into exactly the same thing. So that's what he's going for. The other thing, just to say something about briefly, is this title that he chooses for the book, The American Covenant. So American Covenant, let me see, come back here one sec. Oh yeah, you're looking at the table of contents now? Okay, so I'll just say a quick word about the title, American Covenant. So it's not for him what it might immediately appear to us. It's not like a contract or an arrangement between two consenting parties. It's not a list of values, but for him, finally, it's a narrative. It's a story. It's the story of the American experiment that starts for him with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or even before, as these people, right, leave their home countries, and they, again, symbolically cross the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and they set up a new commonwealth and country in a different land. And so the whole book, and you can see this in the table of context, has this narrative historical quality to it, right? It's got a plot. It's got chapters in it. Some of these chapters are good chapters. Some of them are bad chapters, right? There is chapters that talk about slavery. There are chapters about the displacement and genocide of indigenous people. There are chapters that talk about the loot and rape of the natural world. But there are also good chapters that showcase human heroism and sacrifice and fellow feeling and accomplishments. So you've got all that in there. You've also got certain characters who are heroes and certain characters who are villains. Turns out most of the characters in this story are probably a mix of both hero and villain, right? You've got characters like John Winthrop, who wrote the Sermon on Christian Charity, but who also presided over the heresy trial of Anne Hutchinson, right? You've got people like Thomas Jefferson, who was chiefly the author of the Declaration of Independence, but at the same time, a slave owner, a plantation owner, and in his time, from our perspective, what you call a white supremacist. So, as the saying goes, the line between good and evil doesn't run between people so much as it runs straight through them. I think that's a truism. The other thing you can see just by looking at this index is that it's not a 600-page academic monster book, right? It's not even a 400-page monster book. It's basically a 233-page book, excuse me, that is written for an intelligent but non-professional audience. He means it to be scholarly without being academic, right? So it's an approachable book. It's an accessible book for people without a lot of historical or philosophical expertise. There's a couple chapters in here where he's maybe a little bit more technical, but this is really meant to be a book that anyone can get at. So that, at least what you see here, this is the structure of the book. I'm not going to try to get through all these chapters by any means. I'll just touch on a couple of themes to get. Oh, and that's a kind of I didn't quite finish that slide. I wanted to say something though about these first two chapters, prophetic republicanism as a vital center. And this slide didn't actually really get completed. But prophetic republicanism, and this two-word phrase he's trying to summon up two different things, right? With the word prophetic, there is this element that American history and rhetoric and thinking owes to biblical traditions, right? There's the covenant that is formed in the Hebrew Bible between God and God's people, first in the covenant and the creation narratives in Genesis, but then in the foundational, sort of civic foundational narratives in the book of Exodus, and that these traditions of creation and establishment are then carried on in the prophetic writings. They're developed, they're also critiqued in the prophetic materials. And I think prophetic, at least for me, and I think Gorski would agree, that there's a certain forward lean towards the future, and that we're not now where we hope to be in the future, that the prophet criticizes the king, right? That we're not where we should be, and that we always need to be evaluating where we are now, what system we've got right now in light of what should be, right? We're always continually trying to lean into the future and could be doing better than we are. So prophetic captures that aspect of this central concept for him. And the word Republican, also Republicanism, is also a little specialized in Gorski's usage. Nowadays, of course, it's become the name for a political party, but Gorski would argue that the values, I think, of that Republican Party are not necessarily Republican in the classical sense, and that some of the things that we associate with the Republican Party nowadays are not, he wouldn't want to associate with the word Republican as he uses it. There are, under his definition, probably three tenets of classical Republicanism. And I've got, again, my PowerPoint presentation is a little, I should have had point one in here. Point one is that human beings under a Republican form of government, there's a recognition that they're inherently social creatures, right? They're not just isolated individuals sort of knocking up against each other. There's a human social fabric that transcends human individuals. Republicanism also has this distinct idea of human freedom that has basically three components. And I've got these three components kind of laid out here. One, that human freedom is incompatible with literal or figurative enslavement, right? You can't be an actually enslaved person and consider yourself to be free. You can't be free if you are politically constrained. And in this sense, you might say that you couldn't be free if you were in the sense of a colony of, say, an overarching imperial power like the colonists might have felt themselves to be with respect to Great Britain. That's not a situation of freedom. So there's certain characteristics of freedom there. Being free also, Gorski would want to say, means it's not just a matter of exterior freedom, it's a kind of interior freedom as well. You're not a slave to your passions. And this isn't Gorski just making this up. He is getting this from philosophical and political writers that he's drawing on this to construct this idea, this Republican idea of freedom. So being free means not being a slave to one's passions. Self-control and personal virtue are important characteristics of the free person. And third, and this is pretty key, being free actually means being willing to engage as an active citizen in the functions and in the practice of government. It's not a matter, this Republican freedom, it's not a matter of starving government down to the smallest possible dimensions as if it's a bad thing. There's the sort of free and willing engagement in this system of which we all recognize that we're a part. And this system requires our active engagement. And it also requires not just active engagement, it requires the active engagement of virtuous citizens, right? Citizens who have a certain moral quality and character that will inform and guide their actions as they interact with this, system of government that is in fact a good thing. So this stands in contrast with, he would say, a classically liberal position. Let me see if I've got yes, okay. Classically liberal idea of freedom, and this is taken largely from writings of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and some others. Under a classically liberal view of freedom, freedom means not being interfered with, not being constrained in one's movements. It means having the ability to pursue one's desires, whatever they might be. And, as long as these desires don't impinge over much on other people's freedoms, they are a good thing, right? You may, there's obviously certain limits to these freedoms. Like, you might desire my wallet, but you're not entitled to shoot me and take my wallet as an expression of your freedom, right? There's certain limits on that. But there is this sense that individual freedom should be maximized to the extent that it doesn't overly interfere with another person's freedom. And if you press this to the logical conclusion, you end up with really much more of what you could call a libertarian view, something like that of Ayn Rand, where people are these free floating atoms that are basically, their chief task is to seek their own advantage. And some of these free floating atoms will, bring more to the table than others. Some will be naturally more powerful than others. These particularly powerful natures should not be restricted or bound in the expression of their freedom, right? If you're John Galt, is it John Galt that's in the Fountainhead? I'm a little rusty on my Ayn Rand. But these, these superheroes of the human spirit, these Nietzschean Ubermensch, right? These people actually sort of deserve, in a certain way, to expand to their maximal extent as an expression of human greatness, right? They're not supposed to be held back by this fabric of mutuality or society that would constrain the expansion of their, brilliant individualism. So it's definitely this conception of freedom. It's definitely more atomistic. It seems less willing to recognize that these individuals are caught up, or maybe caught up, in certain force fields that could bind them or limit them. There wouldn't be things under this classically liberal idea of freedom like systemic forces, like systemic racism, for example, or limitations that would be imposed by the power of markets or economic forces. And you can see this, popping up in the statements of certain sort of figures who are somewhat iconic now within conservative movements, like Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, for example. Margaret Thatcher at one point said, "There is no such thing as society," right? There's just individuals, right? So that would be the sort of a classic, what you could call conservative standpoint that you would nowadays associate with Republicans and the Republican Party. But in fact, that is not at all. That's actually sort of quite different from classical republicanism, which sees government as necessary to bringing about a just society, not something that needs to be whittled down to the absolute nub in order to not, constrain human freedom. So there's some interesting ways in which what we now take for Republicans and republicanism is just sort of 180 degrees opposite from what classical republicanism is. And same with liberalism. Classical liberalism is actually, in many respects, more like, small state classical republicanism. And again, I would yield to John or Mary, professors who are in their field here to chip in on that. But that is at least how Gorski breaks things down. And I think my next slide is a little graph on this, if memory serves. Yeah. So civic republicanism versus classical liberalism, right? And so on these, and I haven't even gone through all of these things. Human nature under civic republicanism, humans are inherently sociable, whereas in classical liberalism, humans are inherently selfish. as far as human freedom goes, freedom is complex. Involves self-mastery, it involves rule of law, but it also involves active citizenship. Human freedom under classical liberalism is basically a matter of non-interference. When it comes to institutions, civic republicanism calls for civic virtue as well as proper design. So it's not like you need good people and you need good systems both, right? Classical liberalism, according to Gorski, there's more emphasis placed on the proper design of systems. I think it was Immanuel Kant actually who said that if you had the right system, if you had the right government, you could basically, the citizenry could be composed of devils. But if everything was all kind of set up in such a way that you had mutually competing self-interest and checks and balances and so forth, you could construct a system that would work with human nature that was, seen at a very low level. Whereas in civic republicanism, we actually require a certain kind of civic virtue. And again, he's drawing on theories of government and theories of virtue that would go back to Aristotle in this way of thinking. And when it comes down to constitutional balance, civic republicanism calls for institutional and sociological modes of constitutional balance. And I won't even go into some of these details here because time-wise, I need to sprint ahead. We're just down in the last 5 minutes. So, in fact, maybe what I'll do, I was going to just touch briefly. You can see what I've thrown up here is a little excerpt from John Winthrop's speech, Christian Charity. So this is really the first chapter in Gorski's historical narrative. And this is such a beautiful piece. I mean, this would probably for Gorski rise to the level of a foundational, almost scriptural document about this covenant between God and us, that we have entered into this covenant, we've besought God's favor and blessing. And hopefully, if we enter into this covenant in the right spirit, if we honor it, he will seal this commission. If our performance is strict, if the articles contained in it will be successful. If we neglect the observation of these articles and dissemble with God, shall we fail to embrace this world and prosecute our carnal intentions, then the Lord will break out surely in wrath against us, be revenged of such a faithful or a sinful people, make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant. And then a little bit further on in the speech, you've got this beautiful little section about we must entertain each other in brotherly affection, willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities, uphold familiar converse with all in meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality, delighting in each other, making each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body, right? That corporate vision, that social compact where people are looking out for each other, that is a classic piece of republicanism for Gorski. Let me just dart ahead to a kind of a summary statement. That was the summary statement right there. So this is towards the end of the book after he works his way through all of these sort of different chapters of American history, through the founders, the usual suspects, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, and so forth, through the Civil War and through early 20th century, post-World War II. He ends with this summary statement, and I better tie it off here, but a righteous republic, he would say, is based on a certain vision of the common good, not just any vision, but a vision that draws deeply on prophetic religion. Now, what is it that makes that righteous rather than just moral? What's the difference? Prophetic ethic of righteousness is social as well as an individual ethic. It demands the political community protect the weak and the downtrodden from the high and the mighty. Prophetic ethic is also an egalitarian ethic. At the core of prophetic religion, an ethic of social justice and human equality that requires that we be willing to abridge ourselves for the sake of others, right? And he's obviously alluding to that language of abridgment that you got in Winthrop's sermon. A righteous republic is also based on a certain vision of the political community, one rooted in the Republican tradition rather than its liberal rival. What's the difference? The Republican tradition is both more realistic and more idealistic. More realistic because it regards liberal institutions, for example, rights, elections, checks and balances, as necessary but insufficient safeguards of the common good. And balance between social groups is crucial. and more idealistic insofar as it regards civic virtue as a necessary condition for the continued survival of popular government, right? Personal virtue is necessary within this tradition. Self-interest alone is never enough. So that is, what is pretty much a concluding statement to Gorski's book. And I think you've got hopefully a pretty good flavor of it there. I was hoping to leave a little more time at the end for some back and forth. I'm happy to stay on and talk a bit more. If folks need to edge off to take a break before getting on to 11 o'clock, please feel free to do that. But let me tie it off right there. And like I said, if folks need to edge out, please do. But I'm happy to stay on and chatter a bit. Thanks for tuning in.
Greg, how about a closing prayer?
Oh, yeah, I'll do that. Join me. Gracious God, thanks for this time together this morning. And thank you again for your servant, Tony Abbott, and his good work amongst us, his gentle spirit that still abides with us. Help us in these complicated days to find generous hearts and spirits open to reconciliation, open to change, soft-hearted and reasonable, we pray. Inform all of this with your loving spirit. Amen.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
That was really
Thanks, Greg.
fascinating.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
So I'm still here if people want to stick around.
Greg, this
John,
is,
how did that? Oh, sorry, Cecil, go ahead. Cecil.
yeah, I was sort of halfway expecting at some point during this introductory part to hear the phrase American exceptionalism as part of this civil religion. The idea of America not only being a sort of a chosen instrument of God's will in the world, but this bright shining city on a hill example to the rest of the world, and only emphasizing the good chapters, as you mentioned earlier, and not the bad chapters.
Well, right, the city on the hill, that's also, that goes back to Winthrop's speech. And what's interesting about Winthrop's speech is you do get the city on the hill, but it's also premised on certain kinds of behavior, right? It's premised on all those things that were in that excerpt that I read from Winthrop. And if you go back on that and fail to fulfill that side of the bargain, you've lost your exceptional quality, right? I think in later iterations of this, John, you're going to know so much more about this than I do, right? There's this, you go from exceptionalism to kind of American triumphalism, when in fact, even in the absence of those virtues that Winthrop mentions, America has this, big chested moral superiority to the rest of the world. And certainly Gorski would want to say, now that's definitely shading off in the direction of Christian nationalism, of thinking that we are somehow intrinsically and by nature favored of God, when in fact that special status is conditional on certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of honoring of the covenant. And so that's not, American exceptionalism is not something certainly that would be part of Gorski's understanding of the American covenant. And I would have to look it up. I'd be interested to see even in the index if he, do we find the word exceptionalism or American exceptionalism? I don't see anything under exceptionalism, but I imagine he would probably rank that under Christian nationalism rather than his vision of civic religion.
Yeah,
I think that's right. Greg, one just passing comment. The Winthrop passage is interesting because apparently it was a sermon that he preached on the Arbella, which was one of 10 ships bringing Massachusetts Bay Colony over to the New World to kind of establish an independent colony separate from Great Britain, because they packed up lock, stock, and barrel and brought the whole company to the New World.
Yeah.
Really talking about we're going to this is the to to use the phrase on the dollar bill, this is the Novus Ordo Secula. This is the new order of the world that we're getting ready to establish.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that has a status of kind of a charter document, right? There's still, I mean, it's delivered on board, right? So yeah, they've not even arrived yet. This is the forward-looking charter for what this experiment's supposed to be like.
That's right.
So yeah, I love quote. There's just so many beautiful little passages in there. It's great if you can treat someone to that. It's just delightful to taste it, I think. So.
Okay, I've got a question, Greg. I was thinking about your circles that you showed us, and I think our generation is very much in that middle circle that overlaps. But with the secularism and so on in the, I guess, left-hand circle that was there, are we moving toward that circle, or are we're going to stay in that overlapping circle of secularism?
Yeah, I mean, I think in 2008, when Gorski started this book, he might have hoped that there was some centripetal force that was provided to some degree by Obama's leadership and vision and rhetoric that might keep that center overlapping section together. I feel like in the last 4 years, there are centrifugal forces, right, that are like spinning the thing to the edge. And so now I would say, right, that the forces to separate and diminish that middle ground are much stronger. I mean, maybe they were always there, always latent, but they just seem to be more out in the open now. And maybe that's even a good thing. But just driving those two circles apart to where you have secular, you've got secular, rational secularists and then Christian nationalists with no overlapping zone of discourse or shared sense of identity or foundational traditions that can be appealed to negotiate differences. And instead, all you start doing is just lobbing mortars from one zone to the other, which is kind of where we are now, to be honest.
Yeah. Thank you. That's an interesting response to that question. I appreciate that. The centrifugal force.
Yeah, well, it's the best I can do on the spur of the moment.
And Greg, I would say that's particularly true of the younger generations. Unfortunately, that I think we see a generational change toward the extreme, particularly of the secular.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would see that on my kids,
Yeah.
I mean, when it comes, I mean, certainly there's some monuments that just frankly ought to be torn down, but, there's some characters and, individuals who, you ought to approach a little more critically and not just throw them out on the junk heap, I think. So yeah, you just see those impulses, I think, in a lot of modern discourse, and I get from my own kids.
Well, I'm going to jump in right here and let you know that I'm going to stop the YouTube live feed.
Oh, okay. Oh, geez, I forgot we're discoursing to the whole internet here.